So I think that GLP-1s can be used as a catalyst for lifestyle change. And that is the best use case they could have.
This drug, I mean, it is so effective at suppressing your appetite. So if there are reasons other than physiological hunger or environmental stimulus or social implications, it really does give an individual the opportunity to pause for a second.
People, unfortunately, have to take responsibility for their health, and social media, as dangerous as it is to get information, where else are they going to get it?
I think there's probably a degree where we perhaps are confusing, weight gain or weight loss and associating that perhaps directly with, fat gain or muscle gain.
But the truth of the matter is, at the end of the day, like you guys, I just want people to be their healthiest. And I think that is most achievable when we have.
Welcome, everybody, to the Lasting Weight Loss Podcast. I'm super stoked because I have the opportunity to speak with some amazing individuals here. First, we got Dr. Nick Norwitz. Do you like being called Dr. Nick, or do you go by Nick?
Nick, some guy who ate a bunch of eggs, Oreo, doctor. I've heard it all. I really don't care. I'm a pretty informal guy.
All right, we'll definitely get into some of that here shortly. The thing that for me really resonates with you is your mission right now to help normalize metabolic health. So I'm super excited to get into that. And then we also have Holly Baxter, who is educated in food and science nutrition, has a master's in dietetics, collegiate bodybuilder too as well. And you also work with clients and individuals in the weight loss arena too as well. So definitely interested to take your input and look at how we approach the GLP-1 space. And I think this will be cool, guys. I think it'll be cool to kind of spitball because we all come from different, very different perspectives. So welcome.
Thank you.
Nick, I wanted to, as I know today we discussed having a conversation about obesity, GLP-1 medications, and a little bit of that social media pizzazz, because I feel like there's a lot of social media influencers out there that, I hate to say for the word, flex their degrees and really aren't up to date on some of the things that are really starting to change in the way of metabolic health. And being as how this is your expertise and what you have your PhD in, I'm excited to talk about obesity and how you describe it as a condition of disordered fuel partitioning, which really resonates with me because I have clinics and I work with patients. I've been doing it for the past 15 years, and metabolic health strategies like fasting and keto and now carnivore have always been integral. And so, please dive into this, how you look at obesity as a disordered fuel partitioning issue.
Absolutely. I first want to frame this by saying, what my expertise are and what they aren't, and what I'm going to say and what I'm not going to say. With respect to GLP-1s, because I know we'll be getting into it, I want to be very upfront. First of all, that is not my area of expertise per se. I read the literature, and so, I have some insight, but I'm also not a clinician who's prescribing this. I'm a PhD scientist and a fourth-year medical student, so I'll be very clear with anything I say, be it on GLP-1s, carnivore, obviously I'm not making medical recommendations, but beyond that, I really am trying not to put a value judgment on any of these things. That's not my place as a scientist. I'm just here to speak to the data. So I can tell you about some really interesting things about GLP-1s, differences between Wegovy and Tirzepatide, and why the latter might have some really interesting metabolic properties, but it's all from an angle of this is scientifically fascinating. Same for carnivore. I don't care if you're vegan. I don't care if you're carnivore. The nice thing about metabolic health is the proof's in the pudding, your results. And at the end of the day, I think we should all, and I think we all are, at least the three of us, happy when somebody succeeds and gets to a point where they're healthier. So my whole thing is about educating yourself, becoming metabolically informed and metabolically curious so you can engage in this N=1, personal health journey. We can talk about my philosophies about health, but I just want to frame it with all that. Now, with respect to fuel partitioning and obesity, there's a lot of ways to frame this. And it's really hard to get it to resonate with people because we've internalized calories being at the center of obesity. It's beyond just, I think, conscious cognition. We have internalized messaging that we've just gotten exposed to over most of our lives. So I'm going to say something, and hopefully by the end of the conversation, we will have some consensus on this and people will really understand what I'm saying, although I know what I'm about to say isn't going to resonate with everybody, which is calories are a description of what happens in chronic obesity, but they are not the cause of obesity. And the distinction, the nuance that's in there, I think is really critical, because I'm not saying calories don't matter. I'm not saying human bodies break the law of thermodynamics. I'm saying, basically, another way to frame it is calories in, calories out. It's just a description post hoc of what happened when you gain weight, let's say. But it is not in any way, shape, or form a biological or physiological explanation of what causes weight gain. If you actually want the cause, you need the physiology, you need the etiology, and that is not calories. It has more to do with how your body responds to the fuel you're consuming, how it partitions it, what it does with it. Does it use it for energy expenditure, either exercise, NEAT, thermogenesis? Does it put it in lean tissue? Does it excrete it? There are things you can do with your macronutrient intake that can change, fecal excretion of calories. Or do you partition it in fat? And then consequently, what happens? Because if you partition more fuel as fat, you end up with lower energy expenditure and greater hunger drive, which leads you to the calorie imbalance, but as a downstream consequence of physiology rather than the initial driving cause. And we can step through some of the literature and how it can be very misleading, even things like metabolic ward randomized control trials, because I understand how people have gotten confused and misled.
Absolutely. We should dive into that. With respect to what you just said, is it safe to say that the energy balance, if an individual is in a surplus, you're going to gain to a certain extent, regardless of the hormones in the background dictating, like you said, the physiology? You can expect to a certain extent some fat gain, but if your signaling in the background is more optimized, metabolic health is more sound, you're going to have to a much lesser degree the likelihood of fat storage and maybe shifting towards muscle building than you would say for a poorly metabolic health individual.
No. And here's why.
Okay.
Tell me how you define a surplus.
I would define a surplus as any caloric intake above the individual's total daily energy expenditure.
And how are you defining that?
The number that we all seem to...
Right, because it's a tautology. You have someone, we can actually get into this example later on, but there was this JAMA cardiology paper that just came out, and they were saying the person ate something on the order of probably about 12,000 calories and yet was losing weight. Now, he'd be in a deficit definitionally, because he lost weight, right? And so I've done overfeeding experiments, where I feed to 5,000 calories. Now, I'm a small guy, and given my activity level, that is well beyond my estimated needs based on a Harris-Benedict formula in the exercise I do. And if I'm not gaining weight, am I in a surplus or not? So it's a tautology, because you can always go back and say, well, you weren't really in a surplus. I had some tweet recently about or maybe there's a thread about, it was a Nature Medicine paper. I can find you the reference, but it was how ketogenic diets change microbiome metabolism to increase the fecal excretion of calories. And you could take the calories in approach and say, or calories out approach and say, look, calories out, this fits into the thermodynamic equation. But the calories didn't describe what went on there with the physiology. And also, practically speaking, do you know anybody that collects all their fecal matter and puts it in a bomb calorimeter so they can include it in their calories and calories out equation? So when you tack on all the practicalities to it, you can always go back and try to post hoc explain why something was or wasn't a surplus or deficit. But that doesn't speak to the physiology. So it's true. If someone gained weight, they were in a surplus. But that doesn't actually mean the surplus caused the weight gain. These things can be consistent. Calories in minus calories out equals weight change is not a causal statement. Do you know what I mean? And it can be misleading because of the way research is conducted. So, for example, say you take somebody and you put them in a chamber and you shove 10,000 calories per day down their face for a week. Do I expect, irrespective of their macro breakdown, they'd gain weight if they're being sedentary? Yes. But I also wouldn't argue that actually recapitulates the physiological driver of obesity development in a real world setting, because they wouldn't be able to maintain that. Their body would adjust. So the question we really care about is what's causing obesity in a real world setting.
Right.
And we don't have data to say that's calories. You can bring up studies if you want, but I don't think we have those data. It's more a matter of we've always been interpreting it within that framework. So you even look back at recent randomized controlled trials like DietFits, a major randomized controlled trial. You do a reanalysis of it and look at, do a mediation analysis and see what was driving the weight loss. It was glycemic load reduction in both groups, which is consistent, not calories. Glycemic load, not calories. So it's consistent with a model that is more physiologic, biologic, not calorie centric. I'm not saying calories don't matter. I'm saying they're not a physiological model of obesity at all. It's not that the model's wrong. It's that it's not even a model of obesity from a physiological or biological perspective. And in that way, I do not think it's helpful. Actually, it gets more harmful than helpful.
No, that makes sense. That makes sense. Before we dive into that, because I am thinking of some research that I want to bring up. Holly, I want to ask you from your perspective, having also worked with individuals for quite some time, and I know in the background, you used to focus, as a lot of us did in this industry, on what we thought was the right path, which is calories and macros. So tell me a little bit more about the success you've had, right? Maybe looking at calories. And then I kind of want to mesh that with what Nick is telling us, because there's the research and then there's real world what we're seeing in the trenches.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I can get behind some of what Nick said. And then there's also what I've seen anecdotally, like in my own experience as a professional bodybuilder, and then also like in a clinical setting worked with thousands of clients. So I think there's probably a degree where we perhaps are confusing, weight gain or weight loss and associating that perhaps directly with, fat gain or muscle gain. But I think there are so many other variables that can contribute to scale weight changes. So I think, just as an example, to kind of really oversimplify this, I might see a client who has increased their body weight over a 7-day period. So their average might have gone up by, a couple of pounds. And they'll initially jump to conclusion and assume it's all bad, it's all body fat. But then when we actually look and analyze all of their data, there will be changes in their glycogen consumption from the previous week's average. So, they might have increased their average carbohydrate by 20 or 30 grams or so. Calories equated. They've just switched around their macros from fats to carbohydrate. So we know when we make those kinds of adjustments, we've got potential for increased muscle glycogen storage. And with every 1 gram of glycogen that we store, we're also going to be, drawing in two or so mil of water. So there's initial changes on the scale that are directly related to glycogen and water. I think, if we also make adjustments to our macronutrient ratio, changing around protein, carb, and fat, we're probably interfering with the amount of dietary fiber that we're consuming as well. And we track all of these types of metrics with our clients. And even subtle changes in, the dietary fiber type. So going from insoluble fiber to soluble fiber, for example, we've got one that's highly osmotic, one's drawing a lot of fluid into the gastrointestinal tract. So, we could potentially be seeing changes on the scale that are directly related to, fluid shift and, food matter sitting in the GI. And then also, depending on an individual's diet, if they're consuming really high sodium or low sodium, just those simple changes from 1 week to the next can also greatly interfere with, scale weight changes. So I think it's difficult to say, if we were just truly looking at somebody's, energy balance and, it looks like they've gained weight, is it really and do we care about that weight? More importantly, is it weight that matters, or is it weight that we do need to be concerned by? So I think it's really important to kind of consider, all of the variables that go into, what might change somebody's weight on the scale, which is what most practitioners are probably utilizing. It would be less common, in a clinical setting for us to have regional measures of muscle thickness using B-mode ultrasound or DEXA or MRI if we're thinking about the gold standard. So we don't always have the best data to make those kinds of adjustments. Now, I know, Nick, you've probably seen in research where they're doing tightly controlled studies in metabolic wards, but I think it's just something to consider. I know lots of people kind of jump to those conclusions. So that's my first comment. Then the other thing that I think is important to discuss might be metabolic adaptation. So I think the old school of thought might be that we have kind of this fixed amount of calories that, somebody requires based on, you mentioned before, Nick, the Harris-Benedict equation, or, we use the Mueller equation because it perhaps considers lean body mass and fat mass. So, we might have an equation that can generally predict what somebody should be consuming to maintain their current body mass and then maybe their activity. However, I think anecdotally what we see, and I think also in some of the overfeeding research and, restrictive caloric restriction diets and research in that area, that there is some amount of adaptation that takes place. So we've talked about, metabolic adaptation through non-exercise activity thermogenesis, changes in, food constituents, fiber being more thermogenic, protein being more thermogenic. So I think that there are a lot of, there's so much gray area where someone might be able to adapt in a positive direction by a significant amount in response to more calories coming in. Their body perhaps upregulates and functions better in response to more food coming in. So there's a degree of adaptation. But I do think, again, in like the clinical setting, we kind of see a bit of a ceiling. So at a certain point, we might be able to drive somebody's metabolism in a positive direction through encouraging more and more calories. But eventually we kind of see the flip switch where, okay, any of that adaptation, it's kind of stopped. And now we're just seeing increases in fat mass, and we're starting to see some other negative changes in their metabolic health as measured, through blood biomarkers and things to that effect. So I think that's just my general perspective of what could also be happening. When we say we're eating a certain amount of calories, we can move them around quite a bit, and there probably is some degree of flexibility.
Can I respond? I love so many things that Holly said that I loved, and I want to respond by citing some data, because she has more experience with clients. And I love taking like I said, the N=1 approach. I love that she dissected, these are all the variables that in an individual could matter. And then when you're working one-on-one with someone, it's always best to be like, all right, let's think about what might be most meaningful in your given situation. I love that. And I also love that she pointed out, people respond differently. You can have different explanations for it. It could be an acquired trait. It could be an inborn trait. So I don't know. You probably do know there was like landmark research. I think the key paper was Levine et al. In Science. It was like the role of non-exercise activity thermogenesis and resistance to fat gain in humans, where they overfed people 1,000 calories. And there was 10-fold variation, I think, difference in fat gain based on non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So we all know those people. I'm one of them. Like, you overfeed me, I just bounce around like a pogo stick. My heart rate goes up. I don't sleep well. I'm just like even higher energy than I am right now, if you can believe that.
I don't have that, by the way.
My brother and my dad, you overfeed them, they just will sit on the couch, sleep it off, and they'll gain weight very quickly. So 100% individual variation. And that's really important. But one thing I really want to hone in on is what she said about metabolic adaptations. Because this is an area where I think we've been most grossly misled in the literature. And I'll give you an example. I don't know if you guys know about that. There was a 2021 study by Kevin Hall at the NIH where they did an animal-based low-carb diet. Heavy air quotes on that. It was not a well-designed diet, in my opinion, if you look at the supplement. That aside, it was an animal-based low-carb diet versus a plant-based low-fat diet. And when the paper came out, it said, okay, low-fat diet led to less calorie intake and more weight loss, more relative weight loss. Metabolic ward trial, randomized controlled trial, crossover trial by a big NIH team, probably multi-million-dollar study. It has all the bells and whistles and published in a top journal to cement it as rigorous science and the basis of truth, much better than, say, an observational and controlled study. And so we should believe this, right? When you start to dig into it, like, even these studies can have these massive flaws. So in this particular case, they didn't include a washout. So participants went from the low-fat to the low-carb diet or the low-carb to the low-fat diet directly without a washout. Now, to Holly's point, metabolic adaptations take time. So you totally expect that, okay, maybe imagine if there were positive metabolic adaptations to a low-carb diet, they're going to be paying off when someone switched to the low-fat diet, and vice versa. If the low-fat diet's causing negative metabolic adaptations, it's going to be blamed on the low-carb diet because there's no washout. Now, this paper actually reported that they looked for evidence of a diet crossover effect and didn't find any, but they didn't report actually any tests whatsoever. So we did a reanalysis recently, and it turns out the diet carryover effect, the effect of the metabolic adaptation, was about threefold the main effect. And we published this basically saying, look, these data, like the conclusions you come to are actually inverted because you didn't account for metabolic adaptation, which takes time. And I raise this as a case in point because a study like that really carries a lot of weight in academia because it sounds like it has all the bells and whistles. You know, it sounds rigorous, and yet it can be profoundly misleading. In fact, you guys might know the name Walter Willett. He's a big nutritional researcher at Harvard. Now, interesting guy to bring up because he's optically not in the same, quote, diet camp as me. Like, I eat a ketogenic diet. I'm not dogmatic about it, but like that is my area of expertise. He's more plant-based. In fact, he's probably the most well-known and cited researcher in the plant-based sphere. Even he called this paper worse than useless and misleading. I have that on video and I posted it on YouTube. So even here, this consensus, like, look, actually this study, when we look back at it, was incredibly misleading because we weren't accounting for metabolic adaptations. So the narrative we had is actually wrong and inverted. The key here that I'm emphasizing, building on Holly's point, is like metabolic adaptations are really key. So these short-term trials, that idea of you take someone and you put them in a room and shove 10,000 calories down their face, and over a week they gain weight, it doesn't actually accurately represent what's going on in a chronic setting. And that's what we care about, right? It's the same with bodybuilding. I mean, you prep for a competition. Yes, if you restrict your calories or you know just fast, the extreme form of caloric restriction, you will lose weight, but that doesn't actually inform well what a good approach would be to optimize weight and body composition over the long term.
Yeah, I just want to add to what you're saying too. I see this all the time, like in practice with clients that we work with, and I've had it experienced in myself as well, going through these various building phases and cutting phases. And we could initially make, an adjustment to somebody's calorie intake by, a measure of 200 or 300 calories, or, several percent higher than where their predicted maintenance calories are. And initially, and kind of to your point with some of these studies that we're seeing where there's no washout period, yes, there are some pretty significant changes initially. However, if we hold all variables steady and constant for a few weeks, then we start to see things changing back in the other direction, where it's almost like your body starts to relax and kind of let go of potentially, this conservative way of being, where the body then starts kind of burning more calories. The person's got more energy. You described yourself as being, you give me more calories, I'm jumping around like an energy bunny. So, it can take a little bit of time, I think, for these adaptations to occur. So, yeah, I think that's a really important thing. And I mean, again, from a practical perspective, I think there are so many folks that, go through these, various dietary approaches. I think the reverse diet, is a popular one. But they're initially so concerned when they see some of these initial changes. And, there's a beauty to having some patience and just sitting through some of these transitional periods, because it is awesome to kind of see what can happen, on the other side when your body kind of has responded better to time, I suppose.
Yeah. Sorry
Absolutely.
to play. Can I continue the game of intellectual?
Please.
Yes.
I got some questions that I'm tabling.
And waiting for people to kind of wait through this uncomfortable phase. I don't know if either of you read that paper by Hint at all. I think it was Nature Metabolism. Adipose tissue retains an epigenetic memory of obesity after weight loss. It was a great paper published a couple months ago, where basically they were looking at, like, is there a signature, a fingerprint left from prior obesity, and maybe like a metabolic scar that needs to fade. So what they did was they looked at fat cells from people with prior obesity who had undergone bariatric surgery and lost at least a quarter of their body weight. And then they compared the fat to people who had just been always lean. And what they found is even after 25% body weight loss, 2 years after bariatric surgery, the fat cells from the people who had prior obesity had a metabolic fingerprint of being less metabolically active, or at least downregulation in metabolic pathways and increase in inflammatory pathways. The reason I bring this up is because, I mean, this particular study, they only looked 2 years after bariatric surgery, not even 2 years after weight loss. So the way I interpret it is, look, there's a metabolic scar that is left in the phase after, or there is a metabolic scar that is left from prior exposures. And sometimes it might take time for that epigenetic memory to fade. Fat cells need to turn over. Like, there are things going on under the surface that are so dynamic that even if, like Holly said, you keep things stable, things are going to be changing underneath. And it might be like methylation patterns in your fat cells themselves. So, it's so much more complicated. I guess the reason I take aim at calories, because I definitely do so in a provocative manner, is not, like I've said clearly here, it's not like they don't matter. It is just such a gross oversimplification that I think it ends up doing way more harm than good. Because oftentimes we don't look systematically at what's going on physiologically and then try to cover it up with platitudes of, oh, just decrease your portion sizes, eat balanced, just watch your calories. Are you exercising enough? Maybe you're eating too much of that. And they're all, I think, harmful platitudes that lead people, at least this is what I've seen clinically in both my coaching and as a medical student out in the wards and in clinics, like this sense of learned helplessness among people where they put in all this effort. Like, I genuinely believe they're working their hardest and they're not seeing success. And I don't think there's often great introspection on the part of, I'll just say, medicine on saying, what are we doing wrong with respect to actually educating people and providing with tools? Rather, the blame is placed on people because you can kind of like sweep it under the rug of something like, oh, well, it'll come down to calorie balance and that's kind of their responsibility to figure out. Rather, I think we need to reframe it, say, what we have as a model of obesity, calories, is not working. We actually need to take a physiology first approach and give people tools so that they can direct their effort functionally. So my zeal, you could say, comes from a place of wanting to arm people with useful physiologic tools rather than let them succumb to what, in effect, I think is victim blaming.
That really resonates, even for my personal struggle with weight. 'Cause I lost 100 pounds when I was 16, and I struggled for like 8 years, going back and forth, yo-yoing 50, 60 pounds. Took me a while to figure out how to achieve stability of my weight, fasting, and that's how I ended up focusing on fasting-based strategies and that's evolved a lot since then. But as the metabolic health for me was crucial to achieve stability, and over the last 15 years, that's all I've seen with patients is this observation that anybody who was obese in the past or was overweight in the past, like you said, and I've never heard it described that way, metabolic scarring, it makes sense, very sensible observation that I've seen, which is they have an increased difficulty maintaining that weight loss. And it does seem like the longer we can give them stability, the better at which they can maintain it. But I just always assumed that was the mental toughness that they've also inevitably developed. And you're giving a nice physiological explanation that, and maybe it's both. It probably is both.
Yeah, and I can give you actually human randomized controlled trial data recently. It was out in Obesity by Martins et al. And this will be quite interesting to you. Basically, what they did is they took 69 Black women and had them lose weight, and they put them on a weight maintenance diet. And it was low carb versus low fat. And what they actually found, very interestingly, is not only did low carb lead to more weight loss in people with insulin resistance than the low fat diet, but even despite more weight loss, and when a body becomes smaller, you tend to experience a decrease in energy expenditure. When they looked at energy expenditure, despite more weight loss, the total and resting energy expenditure were actually higher or decreased by less in the low carb diet in this randomized controlled trial setting. So, it raises the idea that not all diets are created equal with respect to like different macronutrient shifts for different people can be advantageous and can over the long term lead to better success. Because, if you lose weight acutely, but your metabolism slows, it's going to make it harder going forward. And that's separate from the epigenetic scar that might be left on adipocytes. This is just looking at the acute phase. I think it was a 12-week trial. I can get the reference, but so I think there's quite a lot of data on this.
I'm curious to ask both of you your thoughts on, and this kind of plays into a little bit of what we were talking about earlier, social media influencers and heavyweight opinions that people look to and respect. The idea that when you look from my research and understanding, the highest level of randomized controlled trials that we have trying to compare methods of weight loss accounting for calories showed that when you looked at different methods like fasting or low carb, the fat loss, it was the same. There was no increased fat loss when you tried to fast or go keto. And so I think, in my opinion, and this is what I'd love to hear your guys' thought on, I think we're misinterpreting and misapplying. And they always use the fact that these are the highest controlled studies, metabolic wards, because most studies are, most calorie studies, as you know, Nick, and both you guys know, is that they're self-reported and the accuracy of those are very limited, but metabolic wards, very accurate. So they rely on that fact that metabolic ward studies, these are super accurate. So we know without a doubt, you don't have to fast, you don't have to keto, just control your calories. And that's a really good argument from a scientific basis. And I've been trying to make sense of this because clinically, as we talked about, I don't do that and it works. So my understanding and idea to interpret that is we're just grossly misinterpreting those RCTs to think that in real life, hunger and metabolism, which can be affected, like the underlying physiology that you mentioned earlier, those are out of our control. We can't consciously make ourselves less hungry or speed up our metabolism. What's your guys' thoughts on that? I'm
going to have to disagree on the grounds of what I said earlier, which has to do with metabolic adaptations. I mean, even in these metabolic ward studies, it's not a matter of they can't calculate it to a T. So there's usually an error of we had a 50% calorie margin of error, but that's so whatever, right? And it's not a matter of a priori they could say, okay, we took Harris-Benedict calculator, plugged in some numbers, 3,500 calories for a pound of fat, and everybody hit the mark exactly. There's always still a large-ish error margin, and then you don't get, quote, statistically significant differences between different approaches, which might not have even been that different in the first place. You see a lot of low carb versus high carb studies, and it's 45% carb versus 65% carb. So there's a power question. And then there was enough time actually allowed to have this recapitulate accurately what's going on in a chronic obesity setting. And I think metabolic ward studies are handicapped there because they're almost by definition a short-term study. You're not doing a 1-year metabolic ward study. And so, a 2-week metabolic ward study, is that actually in any way, shape, or form useful? And even if you're going to say it's useful and it's supporting, calorie balance, and what I'd really like to see is it be able to predict how much weight people are, it needs to get it to a T. You need to be able to calculate it to a T. And usually still, there are gaps. Significant gaps big enough that if you were to apply that in a chronic setting, you'd end up with someone who has class 3 obesity or, an anorexia nervosa level BMI within, a year or so. So I'm going to actually have to disagree with you.
Oh, I mean, that actually makes a lot of sense. Do you have any perspective on that, Holly?
Well, I think first and foremost, I have never been involved in any specific dietary, trials or randomized control trials. So I can't really speak to this from the being involved in these studies, but I can speak to it having done a lot of nutrition coaching over the years
in the trenches
implementing. Yeah. So I think we've kind of got it down to a pretty fine art, if you will. And it is based or centered around calories, but we don't ignore, the other potential variables that are looking at influencing someone's ability to lose weight. So, I could potentially say to a client and predict for a client. So Nick, you want some kind of predictive equation. We actually have a model or an equation that would outline if you consume this amount of calories over this many weeks, you could get to this exact number. And we can do it very successfully when somebody is consistent with their tracking. That doesn't always happen. Obviously, we're looking at humans, not robots. So the frequency that we'd see a perfect linear line is far less frequent. But we can make some estimations. So I guess to give you an example, when it comes to calculating, how many calories do we assign to 1 gram of weight loss? I think typically speaking, if I'm working with somebody that is a healthy body weight, so let's say we'll have to draw the line in the sand, maybe like 25% less body fat for a female. If somebody is less than 25% body fat, I might use the equation of 5.9 calories per gram of weight loss, because I'm assuming that when somebody goes through fat loss, they're not going to lose 100% body fat. They're probably going to lose a combination of lean tissue and fat tissue. Whereas if somebody were a higher body fat percentage, again, we'll say 25% and above, I might use a higher number. I might use like 6.2 or 7.2 calories per gram of weight lost, assuming that that individual who has more of a reservoir of body fat is probably lower risk of losing lean tissue, organ matter, muscle mass, etc., during a fat loss phase. So they're probably closer to losing more body fat in a fat loss phase. So using those kind of general numbers, I can kind of, make some predictions about if we know what this person's current maintenance calories are. And let's say they've been consuming 2,000 calories really consistently for a couple of weeks and they have maintained their weight for the most part. Using those kinds of numbers, we can then forecast what degree of deficit somebody might require. And if they hit those numbers, we do see that amount of weight lost. So I think there is definitely like the ability to use calories to make adjustments and see, sustained weight loss. But I think the bigger question is, how do people sustain it? Because often we find that we get to the end of the diet and the numbers are, extremely difficult to sustain. Maybe the amount of activity that they've had to increase to help them lose body fat becomes unmanageable. So, in those circumstances, then the only way that I can really help somebody maintain, their fat loss is through increasing their lean body mass. So we kind of then go through this process of building muscle again and trying to bring up their BMR, since lean tissue is obviously one of the biggest drivers of basal metabolic rate. We can really make some adjustments to their new maintenance calories if they're able to bring their lean body mass up. So we definitely have a process. It's definitely not perfect, but I do think we rely on these predictive type equations and calories to see really positive changes in somebody's body fat.
Can I ask a silly question?
Sure.
What is the
There's no silly questions here, by the way.
What is the glycemic load of a diet? If you fast for a day, what was the glycemic load of your diet that day? 0, right?
It probably depends on the person. I mean, depending on what type of...
if you don't eat any food.
Oh, it would be 0.
Right.
0.
So the point I'm trying to make in a kind of cheeky fashion is when you change a diet, you change a lot of variables. And so I'm curious from a scientific perspective, if you have an estimate that maybe is empirically derived based on the coaching program that works for people, and you're typically using similar levers centered around calories, I'd wonder. So if you imagine you have a target that is 6 months away, right? And you're kind of aiming at that target and then, pulling the trigger on some approach. I'd wonder if you used, a controlled calorie calculated deficit, but then used very different techniques. Let's say a very high glycemic load, low fat diet versus a low carb diet. What would the slope of weight loss change be? And would it differ grossly from the estimate? Let's say the estimate is I don't know, well, people not watching aren't see, I'm holding my arm out at kind of a slope. Let's say it's inclined down 20%, just arbitrary angle. If you did the calorie controlled approach, calculating the deficit using low fat, would the slope be a lot shallower? Use low carb, would it be a lot deeper? So the reason I bring this up is because from a coaching perspective and a clinical perspective, the coach and the client care about what happens to the client at the end of the day. That's all that matters. It's the same with any approach. If I try red light therapy and my exercise performance improves, could that have been a partial placebo? Maybe. Do I care? No. Now I'm doing more chin-ups. Great. But from a scientific perspective, those questions do matter. So I think sometimes other things can be going on with dietary manipulation that might be misattributed in a chronic sense. We see this in the literature. So the diet fits example I brought up. There was a higher carb and there was a lower carb approach. And at 12 months, they actually didn't see much of a difference in the initial trial. But then if you look at it in the reanalysis, it turned out one glycemic load was the mediating factor in both groups, not calories, because actually in the higher carb group, because they made their diets, quote, cleaner, the glycemic load actually dropped a lot because, not all carbs are the same. It's obvious. You're having more refined carbs, you're going to have a higher glycemic load diet. If you're eating mostly whole fruits and vegetables, you can still have the same amount of carbs, but your glycemic load goes a lot lower, which is the thing that matters. And also you can have power loss. In that particular study, there was a lot of attrition between months 3 and 12. So you could see like a trend at month 12. It wasn't, quote, statistically significant, and that was just a power issue. So the reason I bring all this up is because I think we can parse what works on a one-on-one coaching manner and tweaking it, and then at the same time entertain, well, there are actually many scientific explanations for this, and is calories actually the best physiologic explanation? I continue to contend to no.
Well, if I can, chime in at least from, because it's funny, like I'm tracking with what Holly is saying as far as working with people for so long and individuals. But then I've always been so focused on metabolic health too, as well, because of my own personal thing that I noticed that's what it took for me. So both of these sort of categories exist. And the current conclusion that I'm kind of arrived at is the difference between the individuals who can have a caloric based kind of approach and have certain amount of accuracy versus the individuals that seem to, like myself, struggle with that is the very metabolic health thing that we're talking about. So if a person's more insulin resistant and or more inflamed for whatever reason, it seems like those chronically elevated, hyperinsulinemia is the reason why to what you're talking about, Nick, and from a very deep perspective too, validating why there's so much nuance and so much differences. Yet when we see individuals where we can control it with calories, maybe the difference is just their insulin levels are lower. And so we can work with calories within that framework. That's kind of how I look at it. But
caloric restriction will lower your insulin. And if you don't mind me trying to put a cordial cap on this, because I really want to get into like carnivore GLP-1.
Yeah.
I just want to really emphasize how much I appreciate your different points of view and also different points of view in general. I'm very direct about my opinions. I definitely intellectualize things. I've been called a logic and data bully at times. I love talking about the science. You can tell I love talking about metabolism. But the truth of the matter is, at the end of the day, like you guys, I just want people to be their healthiest. And I think that is most achievable when we have an intellectual ecosystem with different expertises. You have different expertises than me. People that are going to talk more about a whole food plant-based diet rather than keto or carnivore have different expertises than me. And it's going to resonate with different people and give people different avenues to success. I just want to highlight that because I love that. Like, I know where my niche and expertise are. And I'm not sure how people are listening. Like, there are going to be people that are listening that, like, what I'm saying is resonating with them. And people's like, what the hell are you talking about, you dork? What, Dr. Jones and Holly are saying makes so much more sense. And if they take that approach and it works for them, like, I still celebrate their success. So I do just want to, like, highlight what I'm doing here and being very direct and intellectualizing. Like, that is my approach. It's not going to work for everybody. It's not going to resonate with everybody. It's just me being me. And I really love, one of the things I love about social media is that people do get access to these different points of view. And they can choose for themselves what they want to try.
Yeah. People, unfortunately, have to take responsibility for their health. And social media, as dangerous as it is to get information, where else are they going to get it?
Not JAMA Cardiology.
So I was actually had a couple minutes to share with Holly what we're doing. And, so just to give a little context, clinics that service across the nation, and we've really solidified an approach towards GLP-1s where we microdose. I have medical practitioners and I have coaches, And so very, very innovative. I haven't seen anybody else use them like this. Dr. Tina Moore is another practitioner that I think she kind of really started the motion and the concept of microdosing, but I haven't seen a lot of doctors utilizing them this way. So we essentially strive to use them as lowest dose as possible and really trying to focus on driving in lifestyle interventions. And so to me, I think they're cutting edge tools that are necessary to large scale solve a huge problem in front of us, which is obesity. But what caught my eye when I first reached out to you, Nick, was you made a video about GLP-1s. And like you said, just from a neutral scientific perspective, and you caught my eye because I believe, if I remember correctly, you said something about how they should be used and what your thoughts were on that. So yeah, I'd like to start there. Just kind of what is your current understanding of what exactly the science is behind them, how they're working, and what is your thought on how they should be used, if you have any?
Yeah. When I say should, I'm talking about population level, not individual level. That is not my place. I am not yet a clinician. I think they are really incredible tools that are scientifically fascinating. When I cover them, it's because it's like, well, that's interesting. Like, this is how it quiets food noise. You hear those things in the clinic, like, quiets food noise. What the heck does it mean? You read a paper and it's like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. It's acting on the dorsal medial hypothalamus to do X, Y, and Z. And this manifests in what's called pre-ingestion satiety. And people basically, when they're cued by their trigger food, don't have as visceral a response. And so you can kind of like match up the human experience with what's going on physiologically. And I think my opinion is their best use case is to use them as a catalyst for lifestyle change. Because the fact of the matter is, we live in a really problematic food environment. They're just like littered with like dietary booby traps. And people are going to be tempted. And it's not just a matter of willpower. It's more complicated than that, socially, environmentally. And I think some people really do suffer from this phenomenon of let's just focus on the food noise. So imagine you can give them something that creates that mental space and mental freedom. So when they're at that dinner party and there's the cupcake or whatever their Achilles heel food was. For me as a teenager, I'll tell you, there's a bakery in the Boston area called Rosie's, and they had these walnut dreams. And I was like a heat-seeking missile if there was any possibility of getting them. Like, that was my food noise food. I could not stop. Now, I didn't have a weight problem, but imagine if I did. If I could take something, including an injection, to give me the peace of mind so that I don't just reach out for it impulsively, but have the pause and be like, oh, maybe I can make a smarter choice. That's an incredible tool. So I think that GLP-1s can be used as a catalyst for lifestyle change. And that is the best use case they could have, rather than using it as the pill mill approach, or I guess, most are injections, obviously, but where, diet and lifestyle isn't really part of the conversation and people just think, oh, this is going to make you eat less. Because I don't think that is a sustainable solution, either on an individual level, probably more for economic reasons, or definitely not on a population level. So my main concern with them is not their metabolic effects, not the side effects, not even the economic effects, but this idea that they become the safety net and then we stop talking about what the root cause of obesity is, which continues to be lifestyle. So we need to talk at a broader level about how do we restructure the food environment? How do we change grossly dysfunctional food norms? And what role does government or just social discussions have in this? So with the success of this pharmacotherapy, I think comes the danger of losing sight of what the real cause is and seeing the tree and missing the forest. So it is more that sociologic perspective that I find the concern. Metabolically speaking, I think that they are a great tool for certain patients. And on an individual level, I'll just say, if I have a family member who's struggled with obesity, and I do, I will advocate for them to have access to this tool because I know the world they're living in. I know what they've struggled with. So I just think we need to have these parallel conversations. I am not pro or anti. I'm interested in the science. I think they're a useful tool in the right patients, but I think it would be a gross shame to lose sight of the fact that really it's lifestyle that we still need to focus on.
Holly, I absolutely want to hear your thought on this too as well. I'm just going to add that it's unfortunate that it's already beyond the point of what you're saying. I mean, Dr. Fatima, I think, or Fatima was her name, came out on. Yeah. She came out on 60 Minutes, January 1st, 2024, and said, it's a brain disease. It's a brain disease. And this, it really upset me. Let's just say that. It was a bad single
flip. I'm about like a block from her right now, actually. She's at
really?
MGH and Love next to MGH. We've talked a few times. She seems lovely in person, honestly. I didn't end up. Did you see that whole 60-minute clip? Because I didn't.
Oh yeah.
Was she really like that? Was a legitimate representation of her overall point and wasn't taken out of context? All right.
100%. It's a brain disease. And that's why I was like, hey, we're beyond the point of it being already used incorrectly or thought of. Removing all responsibility from our ability to take responsibility and its lifestyle. Like now that she's mentioned it and how it's being used is exactly like that. And of course, people, right? As soon as they hear that, it's not me, and that's the problem. That's the problem right there. And I don't know how we're going to beat that. Holly, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely the Band-Aid solution, right? I think I liked what Nick said before that, it allows people to pause before making a decision around whether they need to eat something else. And I think this is kind of relevant to me because a lot of the people that I'm working with have come to me with a background of disordered eating or eating disorders. For those that don't know, I openly shared my story on the Peter Attia podcast about, a lifelong struggle with an eating disorder. So I think that for many individuals, there is definitely a huge psychological component to this. So, this drug, I mean, it is so effective at suppressing your appetite. So, if there are reasons other than physiological hunger or environmental stimulus or social implications, that are making somebody choose to eat more food, it really does give an individual the opportunity to pause for a second and actually think about that. Am I actually hungry? Do I have a physiological need to eat right now? Or is this something that's related to an emotional circumstance? Is this a feeling of anger or frustration or sadness? It just allows for that pause. So I have several clients that are utilizing the drugs at the moment. And, I think when you're using this in conjunction with diet and lifestyle intervention, I think it can be very effective. I wouldn't say that I'm pro it. I'm not against it. I think it can have its benefits. Absolutely. But I don't think that it should be treated as a disease, or obesity should be treated as a disease of the brain, which completely bypasses, personal responsibility and accountability for your choices when there are decisions to be made that could help you and improve your health. So I think that was the first thing that I kind of wanted to comment about. I have other thoughts about the potential risks that are maybe being overlooked at the moment. I don't know if you want to go there right now, but I'll throw it back to you guys.
I guess one thing I'd add to kind of like shift it away from the brain is think about all the peripheral diseases we're looking at using GLP-1s for. Polycystic ovarian syndrome. Take one. Now, right now, this is in preclinical settings, but like what we do know is there's a GLP-1 deficit peripherally in a lot of insulin resistance related disorders, including diabetes, including obesity, including PCOS. So, I mean, like from a clinical perspective, you can almost think about treating, it as a primary endocrinopathy. So, like, what happens if you have Hashimoto's and hypothyroid? You give back thyroid. What happens if you have adrenal insufficiency, Addison's disease? You give back cortisol so you don't have cardiovascular collapse. You replace the missing hormone. And we know in these insulin resistance disorders, a lot of them, GLP-1 levels are low. So are we just replacing it? Not really. It's a super physiologic dose. But the idea that there's actually a peripheral metabolic dysfunction, maybe having to do with inflammation in the gut. There's cells there that like sop up GLP-1, decreases bioavailability, won't go into L cells, yada, yada, yada. Point being, there are lots of use cases beyond obesity, and beyond the brain, which GLP-1 is being explored for, which suggests it's not just brain disease, and it's also not just as simple as weight loss. There's literature showing that GLP-1s reduce inflammation even independent of weight loss. So there's more going on here, and it's a tool that could be used and is being used outside of just obesity medicine. So it's a cool tool with multiple applications, kind of a Swiss Army knife of sorts. I love understanding how it works, how these different drugs work, because it's just physiologically interesting. Like take Tirzepatide. Sorry to go on a tangent for a sec, but like, what is
You're
the
good,
difference between Tirzepatide and Ozempic and Wegovy? Tirzepatide is the one that's a GLP-1 and the GIP.
And a GIP.
What is the advantage of that? Well, it turns out fat cells don't really have much GLP-1 receptor. They do have the GIP receptor, and the chronic activation of the GIP receptor on fat cells increases uptake of glucose in the postprandial periods. You have more stable blood sugar, increases lipolysis in the fasting period. So what is it doing that semaglutide isn't? Or the GLP-1s aren't? Sorry, I'm throwing right the generic and then the other names at the same time. But basically, like, what is the advantage of this other medication? It's making your fat cells more flexible.
Metabolic flexibility.
Paralleling what we see with different lifestyle interventions. So there's actually like a Venn diagram and an overlap here, again, where you can see it as the catalyst. Could this drug enhance your, quote, metabolic flexibility and help you achieve better lifestyle interventions? Absolutely. So one of the things I also like is like looking at the parallels between these medications and lifestyle changes. Another example, because we talked about carbs and insulin, GLP-1s. Most people think they increase insulin. They don't. They actually decrease insulin area under the curve in a mixed macronutrient setting. So it aligns with things like the carbohydrate insulin model. Sometimes in science, we are handed natural experiments of sorts or large population scale experiments when you have implementation of intervention on a population, and you just get to study the physiology and you get to learn a lot from it. I like taking that approach to this, but interesting tool, a lot of use cases, not just a brain disease.
100%. There's so many. And there's a couple things I wanted to respond to what you said, Nick. My gosh, where do I start? Probably metabolic flexibility, because we use peptides too. And our favorite peptide where we get the best results is AOD 9604. And I've always looked at AOD as a peptide that improves metabolic flexibility, mobilization of body fat. Because I look at, and from my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, Nick, but hyperinsulinemia, elevated insulin levels create a scenario where for an individual, their body is going to struggle when you put it into a caloric deficit. And that's the issue with its inability to mobilize fat. So we've noticed, and I noticed clinically, so much more success, even on a GLP-1 when we stack the AOD, because it like compensates for that lower metabolic flexibility that I'd like to think is going on because their insulin levels are elevated. And you mentioned Tirzepatide. That's our preference too. We get much better results with Tirzepatide over semaglutide. And again, I saw your video too on that. And I also think it's because, and this is educated guesses here, but because of that metabolic flexibility part of it. And the AOD kind of confirms that, I think. But I'm really curious on just what is your definition of metabolic flexibility?
Oh, I would say, I mean, technically it's being able to like shift metabolic states and use fuel substrates, as needed. So like, shifting into, fat burning mode when you're not eating, I consider that metabolic flexibility. Being able to liberate, free fatty acids from your fat cells, I would consider a mark of good metabolic health and metabolic flexibility. I can catch myself out on this for a second because there's a little bit of I would call it a flaw in my logic, but I'm going to actually wait and see. Can either of you point out if I were playing devil's advocate against myself, what I'd say right now?
Oof. I don't know.
What I was going to say is, you guys know, for example, I eat a ketogenic diet. If you gave me a large carbohydrate bolus right now, I would fail an OGTT, an oral glucose tolerance test. Even though my A1C is fine, my blood sugar is fine, my insulin is fine, I would appear insulin resistant because my body wouldn't be, quote, flexible enough to use that sugar. So one could accuse me of being, quote, metabolically suboptimal, metabolically inflexible. The nuance here, I think, is that the body does adapt to different states. So if I didn't have IBD to treat with a ketogenic diet, which is my use case, and I ate carbs for a few weeks, I'd be able to use them just fine. So the nuance here, because there's always nuance, is that, your body can become adapted to a particular metabolic state and then be, say, not as good at using another fuel. it doesn't actually mean unhealthy. So there is a little bit of a gap between metabolic flexibility as I defined it and metabolic health. I guess that was the nuance. And it's the same for a lot of things. For example, I did coverage in a newsletter recently on fruit and fructose. And one of the points I made in the video is that fructose has uniquely metabolically harmful properties, but your small intestine actually, quote, detoxifies it before it gets to the liver. So most of the fructose you eat, if you eat reasonable doses, like if you eat like a banana, most of the fructose from that banana will not end up at your liver because it will end up in the portal vein as glucose and other organic acids because your small intestine will transform it. That transformation capacity depends on prior exposure. So if you're a fruitarian, you're going to be better, more, quote, flexible at like changing fructose versus if you're on a ketogenic diet. So yeah, your body's super dynamic over the long time frame. Right. So your ability to use fuels is going to depend on what scenario you're in. So metabolic flexibility is somewhat of a fluffy term. I use it as such. And the same with metabolic health. They're both kind of like porn, you know it and you see it, but it's hard to define. So anyway.
Yeah. And that's why I asked that question. So because there's healthy metabolic flexibility and then there's unhealthy metabolic flexibility, right?
So serving you, right?
Yep. So as somebody like you who never increases insulin, you're going to look like it's not working good initially, but I would imagine and have seen you'll adapt very quickly because you are metabolically healthy. You just haven't done that part of your body for a while versus an unhealthy metabolic person. It's going to take them a while to come out of that.
So does it serve you? Like, I don't need to eat carbs. Being keto keeps my inflammatory bowel disease in remission. But if you're not metabolically flexible enough to liberate fat tissue in the fasting period, and as a result of that, you end up hungry and snacking on the cake that's in your fridge at 11 p.m., that is not serving you. That is something you probably want to address. I don't need to eat cake. I don't need to eat a banana or a mango. So it's serving me just fine. So it's always individual context.
I agree. Unless you have something to add, Holly, I have a different question for you about carbs. Did you have anything that you wanted to add to that?
No, I don't think so. I think, my only feedback or response perhaps would be, how necessary is metabolic flexibility if somebody is able to successfully lose body fat and sustain it? So I don't know that adds a whole lot to our conversation here, but I mean, if somebody is functioning optimally, even if they weren't metabolically flexible, and they were having success on a ketogenic diet, how important is that for, the average person? I don't know.
Well, I wonder if the answer to that question is which metabolic flexibility we're talking about. If we are saying there's the two types, there's the healthy metabolic flexibility and the unhealthy, right? I don't know. I mean, these are just things that I think about and trying to make sense of the differences that we see in individual variability. But like you said, Nick, it's super nuanced.
Mm-hmm. I like that you raised that question because I think what we just did as an exercise together, the three of us, is highlight that sometimes it's useful to interrogate, like, what is the operational definition of this term?
Right.
And another the example that's coming to mind is ultra-processed foods. Mm-hmm. Actually measuring food processing is difficult. It doesn't actually have that very concrete scientific definition. It's used as heuristic broadly, like a lot of things, like, metabolic flexibility or metabolic health. They don't have hardcore definitions. And sometimes it's worth going through that exercise because it lets you see or appreciate the discrepancy between sometimes how things are done in science versus how they're communicated. So, for example, there was a big debate whether or not we should talk about ultra-processed foods in the dietary guidelines. Ultimately, they've decided not to, and that's been scrutinized. But I think just for the reasons we went over, it's like, well, we know what it is kind of from like a heuristic perspective. And if I tell you, it's a smart idea to, not eat ultra-processed foods, you're like, yeah, of course. Like, I'll avoid the Doritos and the things with lots of labels. And that heuristic will serve that individual in life. But when we're decoding things or coding them in science, sometimes we can only use things that have precise, objective definitions. And that often is different than the way we communicate in public settings. And that's okay. It's actually a useful thing to be like, oh, yeah, that makes sense if there's this discrepancy.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, actually. The carbohydrate question was kind of random, but if we were talking about carbs, for you, Holly, when you're working with individuals and you help them lose weight and get them to a good stable state, is carbohydrates part of a healthy diet for you? Or can it be? Is it based off individual?
Again, I think this is probably very much an individual basis. So, yeah, I mean, you have to consider the individual's personal preferences. So, I mean, that would be the first consideration. But if they've had limited success, adhering to that type of dietary approach, I mean, you have to start questioning why. So, of course, there's the whole process of going through looking at somebody's blood work and trying to identify if there is anything else that could be contributing to their inability to achieve a healthy body weight. But more often than not, I tend to find myself seeing things just from a dietary and lifestyle perspective. And unfortunately, Nick, it is usually calories that can kind of play a really big role in this, and just inconsistencies with that. But yeah, I think absolutely carbohydrates can play a part of a normal, healthy, balanced diet. I would say more than 50% of my clients would be using or including carbohydrates and having good success with their weight loss. I think people are probably less familiar with how to cook utilizing like a ketogenic diet. I have tried it myself for maybe a 3 or 4 month period at one point in my life. And it's a really big lifestyle shift. So I think there are some potential limitations around people's, interest in wanting to make those adjustments. But yeah, I mean, for me personally, I am somebody that enjoys a balanced diet, 50-50 carbohydrates to fats after protein. So does that answer your question?
No, it does. And I think this is a good segue into carnivore.
Well, let me just, sorry to interject, but I hope it goes without saying that if posed the question, can carbohydrates be part of a healthy diet? 100%.
Yeah, like her opinion and in a general sense too.
Yeah, and I just wanted to, because of the angle I'm coming at, I don't want to give the impression that I'm like, yeah, of course carbohydrates can be part of a healthy diet. In fact, if I weren't keto for therapeutic reasons, I love sweet potatoes, some figs, some honey, some goat cheese, it can work. So it is very individual. I don't want to give the impression that I think carbs are the devil. It's just from a metabolic perspective with the literature, in people with insulin resistance, there might be a slight advantage in efficacy, which is different than effectiveness in the real world, because there's all these other dimensions. And as Holly pointed out, sometimes the social aspect can be the hardest part, but it's an important part.
I also think there's probably some subtle differences too in the type of patients that we're perhaps working with. So I would say by and large, the people that I'm working with are not grossly obese or morbidly, overweight, or struggle with many, metabolic conditions. I would say that they're otherwise healthy, looking for, aesthetic benefits or some slight, improvements towards longevity. So yeah, I don't know that I'm probably as well versed in working with these individuals that are really struggling, to make these changes. It's honestly, by and large, a few psychological adjustments, some behavioral adjustments, and then just kind of refining things to better suit their lifestyle.
Cool.
So yeah, I think there's probably some differences there.
And it's cool because, so we are working with those different groups, and having the scientists here to help us make sense of both groups working better with different approaches is kind of cool too. That was one of the things I was super excited about, because we primarily work with the more metabolically deranged or busted. I'm not sure the terms that get thrown around a lot, but insulin resistant. And so we definitely have to approach those in a manner where, calories is like one of the last things we're even worried about. It's lowering those insulin levels as much as we possibly can.
Yeah.
That has been my success, my ticket. And that's why GLP-1s just were perfect tool for us, because of their direct, fastest impact way. Yeah. It's easier to take a shot than it is to fast or go keto or go carnivore, to move to pull on a lever quickly and start to move the body in the right direction. Mm-hmm. So let's lateral over to carnivore. You've been making a lot of content recently, Nick, about carnivore. And I personally am 6 weeks into my carnivore journey. And so it's been very interesting for sure, because I've done keto before. And what I've been able to do to personally maintain a more leaner muscular physique myself is more of a carb cycling. So I know if I eat carbs every day, even if it's moderate, I start gaining fat. It's just what it is. I'm convinced it's in my genetics, and that's probably a separate conversation. But when I go at least carb cycling, where I save my carbohydrates for my lifting days, I lift pretty regularly Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and I try to have most of my week's worth of carbs on those days. It just kind of fits, like socially, I'm working a little less, I'm relaxing a little bit more. And then during the week, I'm busier, so I'm going more keto, I'm doing more fasting. And that's kind of the approach that I've had a ton of success with for myself and with the individuals that I work with. But, with carnivore explosion, I'll admit, I kind of turned my eye away from carnivore as it's been exploding over the last couple of years, because truthfully, and Holly, you probably can relate to this, like people are hiring your professional services to help them get into better shape. And so you're thinking like, I'm assuming, well, what can you actually adhere to? And carnivore is so strict that I just kind of didn't look away thinking that it was bad. I just looked away kind of like, yeah, most people aren't going to be able to do this. So why even bother involving it in my practice and how we're helping people? But as it's continuing to grow and the excitement around it is continuing to grow, I decided to give it a shot. And yeah, I've noticed some massive differences. The biggest thing being, so I've been on HRT, hormone replacement therapy, testosterone therapy for the past 7 years. And without a doubt, you're on HRT for more than a couple of years. When you stop, there is a massive suppression, downregulation of your endogenous testosterone production, and a refractory period that lasts several months usually. And most, bodybuilding industry has a more extreme version of that, but it takes a while for most people to recover. And it's so wild, but I had no crash. I did it at the same time. So I stopped my HRT and I started carnivore at the same time, and no crash. And so I'm still trying to make sense of this N=1 and figure out, obviously I'm thinking my body's ability to recover was just significantly increased because of what carnivore did, metabolically speaking, whatever magic it did for me. But so I just wanted to share that personal experience with carnivore, but kind of pass it over to you because, yeah, you've been talking about this so much. And from what I can see, you're not trying to say, hey, carnivore is the way to go. You're just trying to dismantle all this gross misinformation that people are trying to, say about it.
Yeah, it caught my attention first for clinical reasons, because I became aware of patients whose lives it really did transform. And you can say they're just N=1s, but when you talk to a human being who has been suffering for decades, nothing's worked, and this saves their life, and then you talk to like a dozen of those human beings, you're like, there might be something here that is worth delving into. Now, the research on carnivore is incredibly scarce because it hasn't been funded and run. So we're in an area of lots of we don't know. And I'd like to, reduce that area of we don't know to actually we have some decent data on it. And this might be a great, very potent metabolic intervention for people that could really save and improve quality of life. And I would wish that in a truly curious biomedical community, we could get behind that concept. Because I can talk to the physiology, what's going on with ketones and the gut microbiome shifts, and give you a biologically plausible explanation for why some people are seeing tremendous improvements for autoimmune and inflammatory conditions, and those people deserve to be helped. But because of the nature of the carnivore diet, there are so many other topics that bleed into it. Cardiovascular health, longevity, non-dietary topics like climate change or animal welfare. I'm not saying these aren't important. They are. However, it's really hard to have an evolved, scientific, open-minded discussion when all these things are continuously bleeding into each other. And what I've been really disappointed to see is an exploitation of carnivore by people who try to shut it down in a very weak and intellectually dishonest manner. That is not to excuse the extreme and unscientific claims that are made by some members of the carnivore community, because that definitely exists. I'm not saying this is the best human diet. I'm not saying we evolved as carnivores. I'm not saying that. I'm saying this is interesting for particular use cases and deserves further scientific study. So I am offended as an intellectual when, for example, the news of this week as we record this was like JAMA Cardiology comes out with the stupidest case report I've ever read. And it's not just my opinion. I spent the whole last 2 days laughing with other Harvard medical students and professors about how god-awful this report was. Like literally attending saying, if I wrote this as a first-year medical student, I'd get castrated. Or like, where's that nun from Game of Thrones with the shame bell? If you want, I just did a video on it. I literally have on screen the entire report where they refer to the patient as a man in his 40s. Now, for people that don't have a medical background, like that as your entire patient descriptor is, you don't do that. First of all, you'd actually give like an actual age, not a man in his 40s, but also you give some medical history, some, family history of cardiovascular disease, personal medical history of any sort. For this particular case, you probably want genetic history. They gave no details other than a man in his 40s and went on to claim in a few sentences that he was eating 6 to 9 pounds of cheese, butter, and beef daily. It was ambiguously written. And then he then developed these like xanthelasma disease, basically cholesterol plaques on his skin. They showed a picture of his hands. And I looked at this. And again, I was offended that a cardiovascular journal would lower their intellectual bar so low, basically to zero, to publish something that is effectively propaganda against what they see as against the status quo. To me, it was an insult to intellectual integrity. Had nothing to do with the carnivore-specific nature of the study. I said in my video, like, if a case report came out in JAMA Cardiology, or JAMA Dermatology is not a real journal, but like, if somebody ate 12,000 calories of broccoli per day and then they turned into Groot from the Marvel Cinematic Universe, like, I'd have the same issue. This is just an insult. It's not plausible, and there's a clear lowering of academic standards and double standards to shut down interest in this approach. And there's just this unfortunate ecosystem we live in where engagement is the currency, and we see academic journals succumbing to it as much as major influencers. So with respect to keto and carnivore, it's become a sport to knock on them. Like, you gain points if you're outside that sphere by just attacking them shallowly. So for example, there was like one major thread on why the carnivore diet sucks so much. And it's primarily citing studies with like 40 and 45% calories from carbs as low carb thresholds. Like, this is not the same. This is just a gross misuse. You're just attacking it to get social media points as a transparent attack. You don't have to be for it. We can have an evolved conversation about the potential risks of complete fiber elimination over the lifespan, or whether or not this is bad for longevity. We can have these discussions, or, with respect to the heart. But we need to start from a place of intellectual honesty and at least come together and say, this might be helpful for particular use cases. It deserves further study. This is what we know. This is what we don't know. These are the questions we need to ask. But this is legitimate scientifically. And my concern, and then I'm going to finish my monologue because I realize what's been going on. My concern is the increasing widening of this chasm of mistrust. Because when JAMA Cardiology or some influencer goes out and levies such a weak attack, the other is going to see it for what it is. And take the JAMA Cardiology, example. People are going to lose trust in scientific literature and medical professionals. And that is toxic. That is harmful. So it just, creates these more extreme poles, frustration, anger, and mistrust. That's not helping anyone. I don't understand why we can't just ask honest, intellectual, and scientific questions about this. That's my overall take.
Yeah. How do we dismantle? I mean, it's like the elephant in the room here, right? I mean, we know that wasn't an accident.
No. I presume not. It'd be really... Well, it doesn't matter. It's the disconnect between intent and perception. I don't care what their intent was. I mean, their intent almost surely was they wanted a conservative, cautionary tale to dissuade people from doing something that they thought was dangerous. That was probably their means to an end justification. It doesn't matter. If the effect is a loss of trust, and that you're not actually doing any, like, nobody's going to be dissuaded from, I can't imagine doing carnivore because of this absurd case report. But a lot of people are going to see this and are like, well, not trusting doctors in JAMA Cardiology anymore. They're a laughingstock. That's what's going to happen. And they need to see that and respond to it accordingly.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I think there's going to be as much people that are going to respond that way. Sadly, very much people are going to read that and take it for what it is, face value. And that's the stuff that just pisses me off so much because...
Do you think it's going to convert anybody, though? Because, of course, you can imagine like someone who's a very evangelical vegan, like waving a flag on it, but they were never going to go carnivore. I don't think it's actually going to convert anybody. I think people are going to read it differently based on their pre-existing confirmation bias.
What's your thought, Holly? Because I want to, I wonder if we're thinking the same thing, but please.
I think in general, I mean, we're probably seeing this across multiple disciplines with social media and research. I think that there's a growing interest in social media, people trying to perhaps leverage their position as PhDs or experts, and they have a different agenda. So I don't know whether there's always truthful information being shared. And I think that's really problematic because people will grow a really large following. And if they're busy individuals or they don't really keep up with the broader community, it's probably leading to like echo chambers, and people aren't getting a broad perspective of what else is being said. And I think the difficulty for researchers and people in the medical field, they're trying to do all their work with their patients, and they're probably not spending as much time conveying information and perhaps sharing a broader opinion on particular topics. So we are getting a very narrow definition of what these particular dietary approaches are, and they're potentially misrepresented. So I think there's, unfortunately, because of the growth of social media, there's probably more of a need now than ever for researchers to kind of have a voice. So I think it's great that people like Nick and yourself, Dr. Jones, are kind of speaking up about, some of these problems. Otherwise, we could end up with a really skewed perception of specific dietary types. So I don't know whether there's a solution immediately, but I do think that we need more voices. And it seems like we're starting to get some, researchers, having that voice, which I think is great. I mean, it's happening in the exercise science space as well. There was a bit of an echo chamber, and more people are kind of tired and fed up of seeing poor misinformation being spread by really big named social media influencers. I hope that these researchers continue to have that voice. I think it's really important. But I think there's also some responsibility for individuals as well to pay attention to more than just one person, follow multiple accounts, follow people that share a different opinion or have a different bias to you, just so that you can hear, what the other side of the argument might be. Otherwise, you might find yourself stuck in an echo chamber.
Yeah.
One thing I'll add to this, as a scientist who's struggling with it, there's the ideological approach, and then there's the pragmatist approach. I think the reality we're living in, I'll just call it out, is like engagement's a currency, and journals and influencers are going to go after it, and even scientists are going to need to learn to compete in that ecosystem. And it's a little bit of a David and Goliath situation, because if somebody's primary objective is to build a brand, a business, get clicks, make money, then they're willing to sell out intellectual integrity in order to do that. And they can say things without backing that will achieve their aims. It's just true. If they have a big account and they say something that panders to their base, and it's clear that they didn't even, by some scientific standards, look at table. This has happened to me where somebody tries to dunk on me, and I'm like, I'm looking at the first figure or first table in your reference. You clearly didn't read it. This should be an embarrassment, but it's not, because they're big enough to just roll with their momentum and they got their objective. So someone like me, what am I to do? And what I've decided is to I like the idea of just accepting the scenario we have, and also then playing games with it and figuring out how to fight fire with fire, but better fire. And what I mean by that is, and I'll give you a case in point, or a couple case in points. Like, people might know me as, I have a paper that was very popular. It was using Oreo cookies to lower my cholesterol.
Yep. Yeah, I saw that.
And another one where I ate a ton of eggs. That one was actually the biggest one that got literally flown around the world for that one. I kid you not. It's a long story. But bottom line is, you could look at the headline, Harvard medical student or Harvard scientist eats Oreo cookies to lower his cholesterol, and you could be like, well, this is at least as ridiculous as the xanthelasma case. The distinction there, the xanthelasma case being this carnivore diet case we talked about, is, okay, these are the headlines, but what's underneath the headlines? You could look at the whole report for each one. I feel very confident in saying mine was far more intellectually rigorous. I had labs, a case history, I had a protocol. It was a crossover trial with a certified lipidologist and my PCP on board. I report all the labs and like actually give details. The reason I bring this up is what I did with that, and also the eggs. I said, okay, I know how things operate. I want to get the word out about something legitimate. So I'm going to wrap a story around it. I'm going to build a story. I'm going to do a metabolic demonstration in order to get attention. But that attention is a hook to something deeper, to more nuance. So you kind of have to take a Russian nesting doll approach, right? You have to play the game to some extent. And I think that's a fair thing to do. And I raise this because I guess my advice to the listener is the headline's not going to tell the whole story. You need to see how people engage in what their substance is. And sometimes there's substance there and sometimes there's not. And I'm sorry it's not super easy to figure out from like a headline, what's legit and what's not. But the fact of the matter is everything nowadays, and it's going to become more and more extreme probably, is going to be written in a clickbaity manner. But some things are just clickbait, some things are legit bait. And you have to become aware and accept that reality if you're going to find good people to follow. And then in terms of doing that, I think then it's just getting a vibe and building trust. That's why podcasts are on the rise, is because like audiences can, develop a relationship with the host and a trust. So they actually have somewhere to go. It's probably why Joe Rogan is so big. He's like, people, you can like him or hate him. He is authentic. And people know what he says he believes. And he's very straightforward. And I think what this world is lacking is authenticity. So yeah, there's going to be clickbait. I play with clickbait, and some of it is crap and some of it is useful. It's a tool. Like all these things is always context. And you can see I'm struggling with this because the fact of the matter is, and I try to be transparent about this, like as a communicator in this ecosystem, and I'm sure you guys can echo me, it's a hard balance. Like it's something that we should all struggle with. It shouldn't be a simple thing because we all still need to play this engagement game, but we want to provide value, but we still need to play the game to actually reach people. So something to muddle on. I think it's something we should all struggle with continuously.
Nick, I have a question for you, and maybe since you've also started following the carnivore diet recently, Dr. Jones, but I think maybe something that would be beneficial for the listener. I mean, I have my experiences working with people with the carnivore diet or the ketogenic diet, and that largely probably pertains to people that have struggled with like gastrointestinal like issues. So irritable bowel system syndrome, for example. We know that when we take out a bunch of carbohydrate and you lower someone's dietary fiber and specifically FODMAPs, we can see some benefits. But for the average person, who would you say the carnivore diet is best suited to? Is there a typical stereotype individual that might really benefit from trying this? They might have heard all of the bad things, that we have online, and they've read these headlines and they've been really scared away from, this is such a terrible diet. Who would actually benefit from this based on your understanding experience of the literature at the moment?
I would say, it depends on what your use case is. So if your use case is just weight loss and otherwise you are perfectly healthy, let's say if I were that person, I would not go to carnivore first. Because of legitimate risks that I think could be entertained. Like we don't know the effects of long-term fiber elimination. The way I think about the microbiome is like any ecosystem, be it the rainforest or coral reef or your microbiome. Generally, diversity leads to resilience. And if you're just eating meat, you're probably going to have a decrease in microbiome, let's say resilience. And you could think about that as an element of metabolic health. So I think that's a legitimate concern. But then you take a context of somebody with inflammatory bowel disease and it's like, well, if they're going into remission on a carnivore diet, they'll take that risk. That's totally reasonable for that individual. So what I would say is I do not think the carnivore diet is your first stop shop. If you're generally well and just looking for an improvement in body comp, you can try it. Generally, what I hear reported is people like drop fat like gangbusters on carnivore. Could be for lots of different reasons. So people are entitled to try whatever they want. But my interest and my advocacy, and the reason I'm standing up for this is because I think it's a potent metabolic intervention for certain patients that are struggling with autoimmune and inflammatory conditions. Yep. That's the population I'm interested in. Anybody can try whatever the heck they want, but I think there are potential concerns because it's an area of unknown. I'm not saying it's definitely going to harm your heart, your longevity, or your microbiome, because we don't know that either. But I don't think it's what I'd suggest people go to first if they're otherwise healthy. Mm-hmm. What do you think, Dr. Jones?
Yeah, I definitely think without a doubt, autoimmunity is the first category of patients that would benefit. And that's when I do my intro calls. I do these like group, little, small, intimate intro calls that people started our programs. And a lot of it's just kind of meeting them at their place and making a recommendation for them that I think they as an individual can adhere to. And some of them are all pumped to try carnivore. I'm like, if I feel that, I'm like, let's do that. Because let's grab that motivation while you have it now, versus other individuals. I could just tell without even saying it. They're like, Doc, 3 months, no, because I recommend their 3-month trial period. Like, there's just no way I can do that. Yeah. And there's just no point of pushing that individual to it if they just have that mindset. But autoimmunity is a big one. But we've noticed a lot of other non-autoimmune inflammatory conditions, positive response, like post-COVID, Lyme's disease, PCOS, just any really high level of inflammation, even outside of the context of autoimmunity. Really positive responses. And so, yeah, where I'm at with it is, I think if you made me guess, are we going to find out, yes, it is the proper human diet or no? I'm leaning towards yes, but you make some really good points. I mean, we gotta, the biggest one being we gotta wait till we find that to make it a blanket recommendation. But until then, let's move people in the direction of positivity as much as we can, because they're probably not going to stick with the carnivore anyway. So let's get the 3 months out of them, and then let's transition to sustainability. That's kind of my thought.
Well, I also hear it used a lot as kind of like the elimination and reset. So it also is confidence building. If you've never done a restricted diet or don't do many, and you can do 3 months full carnivore, you realize you have the strength to radically change your lifestyle, and also then you can systematically reintroduce things. Mm-hmm. So let's say you have PCOS and you go carnivore and it resolves. Doesn't mean you need to go carnivore forever, but then introduce things one by one. What's going to be your irritating, item? So it is an engineering approach that you could take as a reset. Doesn't mean you need to do. The nice thing with dietary modifications is you're not signing up to cults for life. You're doing a tweak that you can always reverse, or you should tweak. I love tweaking my diet all the time and learning. You should always be evolving your lifestyle approach. So I just wish people would have a more open mind scientifically about it and not just beef with beef for the sake of it because it's trendy. And honestly, it's not shutting. People think it's going to shut down the carnivore movement and it's just a fad and a blip. It's not. I'm pretty confident that it's going to continue. It's going to continue to rise. I think that there's going to. I just see too many people very enthusiastically reporting benefits from it to possibly imagine this is going to blip away. The more hate it gets, the more that population is going to get excited, and then it's just an expansion. You just need somebody to try it, and then they get brought into the blob, and it continues to expand. And it's going to continue to do so until we delineate more with better science what it's good for and what it's not. So rebelling against it is not going to help, I don't think. No. And I think we've definitely passed the exponential threshold, like you said, where now it's got fostered enough acceptance to where, I agree 100%. And, I look forward to seeing what is going to be the long-term aspect of it. And, it's interesting on the other side of it. So talking about how, we all observe its potential use case here initially, at least. But with individuals who do have transformative events, the other side of it is now what we've got. It's funny you use the word cult. A little bit of a cultish carnivore sort of thing that's happening. Mm-hmm. And from the external, it's curious what you guys think. But I look at that and I go, it's an intervention that's been this powerful collectively for individuals and transform their life. You can't blame them for wanting to hold on to it because it's working so well, right? So it's interesting to kind of see where this unravels. Yeah, I say this to people all the time. I've stopped. Well, I used to say it. I don't say it much anymore because it doesn't work anymore. I'm like, look, help me help you. I'm a scientist, for example, who wants to do research on a carnivore diet. The more you're hyperbolic about it to the point of just being like a cartoon, the more obstacles you put up for me in trying to advance the research, because then it becomes stigmatized. And then when I actually try to go to an IRB to get approval, it has this perception in the zeitgeist because people aren't picking out my nuanced statements to highlight and respond to. They're taking the most extreme nonsense statements and posting them and then responding to that. So yeah, the carnivore quote cult has become a meme because of course those things are going to get amplified more. And like you said, people get frustrated and it comes out as an overly zealous statement. If my ask for someone who's enthusiastic about carnivore is like, this is somewhere where quiet voices will carry farther. I have no realistic expectation that the quote carnivore cult is going to calm down around this and let me and people like me kind of advance it moderately in the science. Like you can do whatever you want in your private life, but it's just a social media algorithm. So we have extremes on both sides, and it's just going to be what we have to deal with and contend with. But yeah, I mean, like it also becomes so politicized. Like even in my comments today, people like relate this to like, you know, Republican versus Democrat, this, that, and the other. And I'm like, this is not like you don't need to talk about like a wokeism and Kamala in my YouTube comments about dismantling JAMA cardiology. This has nothing to do with that, or Bill Gates. Like it just doesn't. And people just like to gravitate towards it because it's a good talking point. Like, oh, who funded this? I'm like, irrelevant. First of all, I don't think there actually were conflicts of interest. You don't have to pay a bunch of money to do a case report, but like people always go to that. And I'm like, let's just dismantle the data. That is the stronger approach. It's going to have more progress, but people are going to be people. So I'll shoot me.
Makes sense. That makes sense. Any closing thoughts for us, Holly?
No, I think you guys have done a really good job on discussing the keto. I wish I had more to contribute. It's just for the percentage of clients that I have, it's very small. And I think partly maybe because of the type of people that I'm working with, they're generally metabolically healthy and they're also very active. They're doing highly glycolytic type sport, and it's probably just a less preferred diet. It's not that I have anything against it at all. I mean, I've done it myself and it was very interesting. So yeah, I think I like the idea of, even encouraging people to explore different dietary approaches. If they're not having success with one type, try something else, because there's probably, a bazillion different options that you could try that might be better for you. So, I think it's important not to kind of get wrapped up in the dogma and maybe the political side of things, but I think there's benefits of trying different dietary interventions, and it's probably also likely that it will change throughout the circumstances of your own life as well. I know for me, I've had periods where I've strongly aligned with intermittent fasting for various reasons. I've had periods where I've strongly enjoyed focusing on a very low carbohydrate diet, high protein diet. I, personally subscribe to something that is IBS friendly. So I tend to eat a slightly lower, fiber diet for that reason, to kind of help with reducing, all of the potential issues from having high fiber on the gut microbiome. So, I don't know that I have any major closing thoughts on the ketogenic diet or the carnivore diet. I think they're impartial to me. I know there are certain clients that I know will thrive if they've got, autoimmune disease or gastro issues, as I mentioned before. But no, I think you guys covered it great.
Yeah, I guess my closing thoughts are going to echo Holly's and kind of the long arc of what we've been talking about, which is be it carnivore, keto, carbs, GLP-1s. Like these are all tools. They're tools that are very context dependent. And what I'd want for these conversations like we just had and the conversations we have on social media is to place them in the appropriate context and ask the legitimate scientific questions and approach things impartially, because I think people just feel a very visceral sense of offense when somebody does something that isn't aligned with their like dietary practices. And it's like, dude, if somebody has success on a keto diet and you prefer a balanced diet or a vegan diet, it doesn't detract from your life experience. Vice versa. If somebody succeeds with, let's just say, a calorie counting approach or a low-fat vegan approach, like, I'm not offended. It doesn't change my history with a ketogenic diet and how it helped me. It's just individual context. So context, nuance. That's my soapbox. That's my word.
Awesome. It was an amazing conversation. And thank you guys for taking the time today. I am, very much excited and want to see continual progression in metabolic health awareness as a solution to people with not just weight issues, but as you said earlier, just so many different metabolic health disorders. And it is conversations like this that challenge the status quo and the narrative that's being pushed so heavily. That is, this needs to be had. We have to challenge. We have to be willing to be wrong. We have that's huge. Willingness to be wrong, I think, is probably one of the biggest ones, because how can you progress and grow without willingness to be wrong? And so I very much appreciate it and look forward to many more conversations in the future with you guys.
Thank you both so much. Sorry I was late again, but I really enjoyed this conversation.